Yeah, so eventually, people often ask what happens when all the coins are mined because they assume that miners just kind of go out of business, but that's not the case because there's also transaction fees. And they've been there since the beginning, but in the beginning they were a very small percentage because blocks weren't even full. So once Bitcoin got big enough where it could reliably fill blocks, we started to get a more reliable fee market. But even that does vary considerably, right? So obviously fees earlier this year during the $60,000 bull market were very big compared to what they were during the bear market portion. And so, over time, especially as we get into say the 2030s, the block subsidy will be small enough that the protocol will be more reliant on those fees paying miners. And it's one of those things where this is how adoption can affect security because the bigger Bitcoin gets, while that block size is still tight, means that those blocks are more reliably full. Fees are pretty high in the base chain, and so that can keep security up long term.
Sorry, just before we jump into that, should we just explain to, because some people won't understand how Bitcoin derives its security and why this is important, how the role of miners, etc. Should we explain that?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good point because part of why Bitcoin's network effect is so strong is because it has the highest security. And then the more adoption it attracts, the stronger that security gets. And so basically, with any kind of proof of work blockchain, you have a bunch of miners that are working to, find the next block, which grants them coins, which is pre-programmed to decrease every 4 years, the number of coins they get per block. That's the declining block subsidy, as well as any transaction fees that people are willing to pay to make sure that their transaction is towards the front of the line to get in that block. And so, you know, the larger amount of miners backing that up makes it a much higher hurdle rate for anyone trying to do a 51% attack. And it's actually more risky. So Bitcoin's advantage is that in addition to it being the biggest cryptocurrency, it's by far the biggest proof of work, cryptocurrency, especially using the algorithm that it does. And so this is a risk for chains that are using the same proof of work algorithm as a bigger coin. So for example, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, Ethereum Classic, these tend to be very vulnerable to 51% attacks because it only takes a percentage of that larger coin's miners to go after that smaller one. And so, for example, if 1% of Bitcoin miners are bored, they can go after Bitcoin SV and do a 51% attack and then go back to mining Bitcoin. And so that's why security is important. That's why Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash are not the same, right? You don't have the same security assurances associated with them. And that's why many people view Bitcoin as money, but they don't view these other derivatives as money because they have far less security, far less hash rate, far higher probability of 51% attacks occurring. And so over the long run, the question becomes, will transaction fees be enough to make 51% attacks rare or impossible? And how do we adjust with that? And so I think, the short answer, I've done all kind of this math associated with it to see how it's scaled historically, how it could conceivably scale in the future based on a couple different outcomes. We can kind of model it like a matrix, right? So how big does Bitcoin get? What is the percentage of market cap or the percentage of annual transaction volume that takes place as fees, and is that enough to sustain it long term? And the answer is that as long as Bitcoin continues to grow, the answer is that it should be able to sustain itself. It should be able to generate multiple billions of dollars worth of fees per year, and that creates a pretty high hurdle rate for anyone to go after. And the challenging thing is that there's no proof of how much security is appropriate. It's one of those things that so far has been secured in practice, but not necessarily in theory, where we can walk through the steps it would take to do a 51% attack. I mean, you have to acquire 51% of the hardware, which is now very geographically distributed. And then you'd have to channel electricity of a small country basically into it and start trying to do 51% attacks. And even then, even if you're successful with a 51% attack, you don't kill that chain, right? So I mean, those other tokens that have been attacked, they're still around. It
Well,
just
and I
means that.
also, sorry to interrupt. When I spoke to, I think it was Harry Suddock, when we talked about mining, he said actually it's more than 51% you need to be able to maintain an attack. So you have to be able to create the attack, you have to be able to maintain it. And he said that's also quite difficult. So I can't remember the number he gave to me, but a successful long term 51% attack requires, I think, did he say 70%? I'd have to check. I'll try and check it, but people can listen to that show. But you actually need more than that.
It's not a Boolean outcome. The higher hash rate you have, the better chance you have of that working. And so yeah, probably you can do math on it to find out when it becomes probable. And so the barrier, you want the barrier to having that be done very, very high, ideally. And then you want it high compared to the percent, but the potential gains they could get from doing so. So for example, an entity could short Bitcoin and then do a 51% attack and try to recoup their costs or make a gain from it. And so, you want that hurdle rate to be pretty high. Now, if it were to happen, that wouldn't be the end of Bitcoin, right? Because then that changes how you interact with it. That changes basically maybe the number of confirmation times we wait in order to consider a transaction to be secure. It doesn't affect your older transactions. It's not like they can rewrite the code just because they do a 51% attack. But basically, they can do various kind of, they can do obviously a double spend attack. There's also kind of interference. They can play with the functioning of the transactions being processed. And so I think the way I view this risk is that it's a legitimate long-term concern that you want to watch. You want to see
Mm,
Bitcoin continue to grow. You want to see it maintain a healthy fee market. And that's also one reason why adoption and security are kind of interlinked, because if you do a number of attacks, so let's go back to for example, our government ban example, where let's say you do the kind where you just cut it off from the financial system. So you don't ban it outright. You don't get like, super authoritarian, but you say, okay, banks can't interface with it in the United States and Europe. Institutions can't own it. We don't have, industrial scale miners in those countries, right? If that were to be successful at slowing down adoption, and let's say you keep Bitcoin under $1 trillion market cap for many years, as the block subsidy declines, well, then the overall miner revenue, starts to get weaker, and it starts to somewhat open the door if, say, a state actor like China wants to say, we don't like the fact that this permissionless money exists, and we want to try to discredit it or attack it. And so it becomes at that point more conceivable, still very challenging, but more conceivable that they could, potentially start attacking it, and then that could damage the brand, right? So that could damage the how secure we view it, how suitable we view it as money. And so generally, you want to see that I would describe it as critical mass be reached and surpassed, where Bitcoin is large enough and flourishing enough that its blocks are always full, that miner revenue is very, very healthy from the fee portion, so that attacking it becomes exceedingly improbable. And it's something that it's the way it's designed looks suitable. I think it's going to make that transition well, but it does require Bitcoin being, well adopted, in my view.